And the purpose of this next panel is pretty much to help build on Kshitij's fantastic welcome and opening of the symposium to further set the scene as to what we're actually going to be talking about. What are the limits? What's the scope of data sovereignty? What might be some of the background to it from a range of perspectives? We know that we've got people here from university sector, the community sector, policy sector and so on, and government. And everyone's going to have a bit of a different view on that. So we don't want to define the view, but we want to open up the range of areas of conversation. So, given that I actually don't know all of these panellists personally, I might actually ask them to introduce themselves and then we'll start the conversation. So Ray, given that we heard you on the radio at some ungodly hour this morning talking about data, maybe you could start, please.
Well, it's good the message got out this morning. So I'm Ray Lovett. I'm the Program Leader for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health at the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health at the ANU. That's all you need so far?
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
Hi everyone, my name's Kirsten Thorpe. I'm the Manager of Indigenous Services at the State Library of New South Wales. I've worked in the library and archive field for the last 20 years. And my family are Warramai people from Port Stephens in New South Wales.
I'm Maggie Walter. I'm a Palawal woman, Pro-Vice Chancellor, Aboriginal Research and Leadership at the University of Tasmania and Professor of Sociology.
My name's Finlay. I am here with the Public Health Association today, but I am a PhD candidate looking at the National Key Performance Indicators, and I've also worked quite extensively in the Aboriginal community controlled sector.
Fadwa Al-Yaman, I head the Indigenous and Maternal Health Group at the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in Canberra. It's a government agency.
Great, thanks. So in terms of opening up the conversation, can you, Maggie, perhaps you could start for us. Mm-hmm. In your field and what you've seen, how can you describe for us the scope of Indigenous data sovereignty?
Okay, so
you might want to start just with Indigenous data bit first.
yeah, I think so. So we need to take one step back and say Indigenous data, and I'm really pleased to see on the program tomorrow that we're discussing the real breadth of that data. When I talk, I tend to concentrate around population statistics and official data sets, but Indigenous data is a much, much wider concept than that, and all of it falls within the purview of Indigenous data sovereignty. And the history is, for us as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and other Indigenous peoples, we have had centuries of data being collected about us, but rarely by us, and very rarely the sort of data that we want. And what we're really looking at with Indigenous data sovereignty is to change the paradigm of how Indigenous data are done, and to learn from our brothers and sisters in Canada, US and Aotearoa, to actually have a global movement to really, because you need a global movement to change paradigms. I think it was Karl Popper sort of, you change paradigms one funeral at a time, that it really takes a lot of work and a lot of resistance, but it is high time in 2017 that the sort of data that are collected about us was actually functional for us as well.
Anyone else on the panel want to elaborate on that or add to that view?
Look, I just want to say that a lot of the data that we have at the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare is called a byproduct of service delivery. So if somebody goes to the hospital, Indigenous status is collected as one of many items collected on people who go to hospital. If a woman delivers in hospital as well, we have what's called the perinatal data collection, which again has an Indigenous status item, which we work to try and improve the quality over time. So you can make a distinction between data collection that are Indigenous specific, like the National Key Performance Indicators for primary health care or the ABS Indigenous specific surveys, and collecting Indigenous status as a variable of a byproduct of people accessing services with the view to improve service delivery. So I think that's a big distinction that we can look into, yeah.
I disagree, I'm sorry. I don't see a distinction. It's all our data, it's all data about us, and dividing it into piles of data, Indigenous data sovereignty actually gets rid of those distinctions and brings brings our lens across all types of Indigenous data.
I'm not saying it's not your data, but what I'm saying it's a bit different around.
No.
No, okay.
I have to agree with Maggie because irrespective of how the data is collected or why it's collected, it impacts on us. And that's the key point, is that it impacts Indigenous peoples in the way it's used. It doesn't matter where it's collected from.
I would add, from a perspective of being in a cultural institution and working in government archives, that people often talk about that difference between what is data, what's a library collection, what's a government archive, and I certainly see them all as being the one thing. They're about, as Maggie had said, information collected about Aboriginal people, and it's so dispersed, it's held in many different places, and I think to keep categorising things into those different areas actually adds to the trauma and the challenges of actually gaining access. So in terms of data sovereignty, we actually need to see it as more of a holistic view.
They've covered it all.
No, we haven't.
So why is this notion of ownership so important? Clearly already, and it's not yet the start of the panel session time, we're talking about ownership. Why is it important from your different perspectives?
I guess it comes down to, if you think about owning something, it's usually, so if you think in the broader context, when you own something, you have control over that. So when you think about, if it's a physical thing that you own or possess, then you have control in how things are done to that thing. And I guess the principle, for me is similar with data, in that when we express our wish to ownership or ownership around data, we're expressing that wish to control how that data is used, how it's analysed, how it's collected, how it's thought about. And so that's really bringing that back to sometimes different worldviews, sometimes similar, but having Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people involved in... So I think it overlaps quite a lot, but ownership for me, I think, or how I see it and how other people talk about it, is really about asserting control and authority. And I think for lots of different areas, not just in Aboriginal health, but we talked about economic development, education, other areas. That's what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities really talk about, is having that authority over decision making and those sorts of things. So ownership might be, a word, but I think it has lots of layers, and I think that's what it's expressing in this context.
And look, if you don't have ownership, you can't ask for accountability. And that's what's been missing in this space for a very, very long time. So the instigators, the collectors, the users, the holders, the custodians, whatever they want to call themselves, of our data, have never had any accountability to us about how those data are used, or more particularly, how the benefits from those, because data are a resource, a really valuable resource, and we should be getting the benefits of those data, and we're not. So ownership, you have to have ownership to have authority, to have accountability.
And for me, it comes down to power. Data is a resource. As Aboriginal peoples, we're often disempowered on our own country. Data is used to determine what resources we're given, our funding, what programs are rolled out. We don't have equal access to that. We don't have equal power with that data. So we actually don't have any capacity to really be controlling the resources that we're allocated. And for me, that's a massive problem. The only people that know us the best are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, are the local communities, and we're just not empowered to actually make decisions on our behalf in the same way that other people do when they have access to our data.
I just want to say, to clarify again, so we have some data that comes directly from Aboriginal organisations, like primary healthcare data, and the people who supply that data are the owners of the data, and we can't release the data to any party without their permission. So we have processes around the institute, which is part of our act, that we cannot release the data without the permission of the data provider, who's the data owner. The distinction around the other administrative data is it comes from the state and territories, and they have their own regulations, and we follow these regulations. So that's a distinction I wanted to make around our access to the data ourselves that comes from the state and territories. It actually has its own control processes that we have to follow, and we have again to go to the state and territories before we can release that data to a third party. Now, in order to have Indigenous advice and Indigenous input, we have our own advisory groups that have, Indigenous Australians sitting on these advisory groups and giving advice around the various issues around the release and publication of data.
Didn't you just sack your advisory group?
Sorry?
Didn't the advisory group just get sacked?
We didn't sack it. The Australian Health Minister sacked the advisory group. So we are in the process of actually, they sacked the data groups, but we are in the process of creating our own groups to continue with this advice, yeah.
Can we talk a bit about the distinction between ownership and advice?
You can ignore advice.
Yeah.
I was a member of one of those groups that's recently disbanded, Nagatsi had. And I remember, Fadwa is probably well aware of this, that I've been advocating around particular data that's held at the Commonwealth level to be used in a useful way for probably 2 or 3 years at least now.
It started 10 years ago, the whole thing.
I know it started 10 years ago, but we really started ramping up efforts to utilise this data for benefit.
Yeah.
And my experience in that, it was kind of you're kind of a lonely voice sometimes, because you can see the potential as the program is littered with examples where there's potential benefit for community and society around the use of some of this data. And it's really hard if you're just an advisor to continually provide that advice, and for them to be disappointed that that advice is not taken up. So, that's one experience from that group. I've had other good experiences from that group, other than that group doesn't exist anymore. But I think, that's where the rubber hits the road with advice for me, is that I will continue to say the same thing if I believe that we should be progressing an agenda. But sometimes it feels like if you say that or provide that advice too much, then another way to shut that down is we'll just change structures or function or form and things like that. So, but we're very persistent. We're a very persistent mob, so I guess we just keep at it and go with whatever new structures or functions are created.
So to the panel, I'm happy that we unpack advice versus ownership versus whatever else, but can you help the diverse audience understand a bit more of the context that you're talking about? You've launched into a particular here, but I'm not sure that we're all aware of the context.
I might start from a historical perspective. Day to day at the State Library of New South Wales, we're providing access to material from across Australia. We're sitting on Macquarie Street in a very privileged building, basically trying day in and day out to facilitate access to our collections. We're fortunate that we have a small amount of resources to begin those conversations, but we actually need transformation. We need to build the approach that we are proactively taking material back to communities rather than waiting to people to enter. And we need people to be there making decisions about use of that material. I think so much we see people coming in to do research and they're not being encouraged to go back to communities around consent and around use. And we're certainly pushing that, but there's so much legacy material across our major collecting institutions, whether it's state, federal, government archives and so on, that we need to catch up on, that I think getting the question about data management, particularly in a research context, getting the informed consent right from now is so important so that we're not chasing our tail constantly.
I was just going to say, I know we've been talking about the AIHW, but it is actually about research as well. It's not just about AIHW, and it's about whole of systems and whole of approaches. So the AIHW is set as a statutory body with a whole range of mechanisms around it and is limited by that. So it's actually the whole way is within Australia how Australians see data and researchers, and there is this sense of ownership rather than actually working in partnership and maybe using a licence for that data within a specific scope. Traditionally, researchers actually take that data, and it comes back to advice again. You often have Aboriginal people as the advisory committee with non-Aboriginal people as the researchers, who then get the kudos, get the career advancement, and also then have ownership over our data. That's the only reason I went into research, is because I was sick of sitting on advisory committees with the advice being ignored and actually going, that's actually not doing any good for our communities. So.
And advisory committees can be, I think, very much a two-edged sword, because you go in there with the best of intentions, giving of your time to try and make things better, but often you can actually end up finding yourself legitimating things that you deeply, deeply disapprove of, and having your name and your association being used as a way of giving it some sort of Aboriginal legitimacy, which is then quite scary. And so, yeah. It's all about governance, and governance of data means having a direct say in the decision making around data. Who accesses it, who owns it, how's it used, who participates in it, all across those things. We have to have governance.
The other thing I wanted to say, and it's happened mostly in the international setting, so I thought it was quite interesting today just looking at the program. So the other groups, particularly Aotearoa and Canada and the US, have started from principles basis. And so what's happened in the international context is that those groups, and they're led by First Nations or Indigenous peoples themselves, have decided to take the agenda, and it's really great, there's so much part of that, and start from principles. And one of the things I'd really like to see is, for Australia, is how do we start the conversation, and what kind of principles basis do we want to start from for Indigenous data sovereignty? So I really wanted to raise that kind of at the front, for thinking about towards the end about do we want to start from a principles basis, or are we catching up a little bit? I think we might be, but we should look to our international cousins for some guidance here, because they've done really good work.
Yeah. I mean, this is new. It's a new conversation in Australia, but it's not a new conversation globally. I mean, OCAP in Canada, First Nations, has been around, nearly 20 years?
Yep.
And we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can look to what our brothers and sisters have done and draw on that and use that to really fast forward Indigenous data sovereignty in Australia and get it right.
So it might be a useful place to start, actually, to continue the conversation, which is from the panel, and I'll give you a sec to think about that because I want to say something else. What might be some of the principles you want to draw upon? After that, we'll move to some perhaps more concrete examples of value of data, but have a bit of a think about principles. As I look to our gathered audience, I don't see an audience of shrinking violets. So if you want to suggest a question, this microphone or that microphone, come and stand up, and then we can get the conversation moving. Principles. Anyone want to kick off on what one might be?
I wrote down 5 before I came.
Well prepared.
We'll have morning tea at 10.
But I'm going to just run through, and these are part of my talk this afternoon, is just the sort of starting discussion points. So I'm a real sucker for an acronym, and I really like OCAP because it is so neat in just that little thing, it homes things up. But I thought we need to have P, we need to have pillar. So we need pillar, we need principles around how Indigenous data needs are prioritised in Indigenous data collection. We need to protect our data integrity, and that is through ensuring the quality of data, but also safeguarding where it is kept and who has access to it. We need to support the Indigenous leadership in the space, in Indigenous data processing. We need to have accountability built in, and the principles need to support our rights under the United Nations Declaration for Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because we cannot enact those rights without data. That's my bit.
She makes it hard, doesn't she?
I did have time to think about it.
Did we have a question over there?
Yeah.
Can you come and use this microphone, please? Just introduce yourself.
Yeah. My name's Jason Ford. I'm from Brewarrina, New South Wales. I'm advocating on behalf of the Nimba people. I've come down to share my story with you guys, but I've got a question which I think needs to, I need to ask, as when we're talking about sovereignty around data, who does the sovereignty represent? Because when we're talking about cultural groups, okay, and inherent rights of specific nations and how they define the nations, everything's been taken away. All the power's been taken away from the tribal groups and the people. And, you know, people in their endeavours to try and do things on, you know, the bet for the people on the ground that are suffering since colonisation, a lot of the people, we don't know what this represents for our cultural existence and how we actually get to be part of that space, locally at a community level. And I'm talking about the governance structures of themselves. So the governance structures that are being recognised by the bureaucracy to be, you know, having consultation with are not the people on the ground, especially the local, the little guys that are trying to build up rebuild their nation groups amongst all this, you know, these different types of endeavours to help our peoples. But I think we need to understand where does the sovereign, what does it mean for the different groups, the different tribal groups and identities that we're representing here, and where do they fit into this movement? Because, you know, nation rebuilding can't happen without that, I believe. So I'm just asking the panel what they think and how do we make that happen?
Terrific. So sovereignty perhaps requires some concept of nationhood and nation.
I think so, yeah, like, especially the governance, when we're talking about governance, nationhood and sovereignty, they run hand in hand.
Yep.
So there needs to be some type of mandate given to the bigger organisations or institutions by the littler groups if they want to be able to, you know, take control of data.
Terrific. Thank you for your nice soft opening question for the panel. But that's what we're here for. Thank you.
Well, I really totally agree with you. I mean, even when we talk about getting advice and governance, we're talking about invariably people in academia or people who work in other government departments who are Indigenous. We actually don't have a mechanism to address the issues that you've just raised, and I totally agree that this is really an important gap, and we don't have a mechanism to do that. Yeah.
So Jason, there's, I think it's a really important question, and it's one that I've been thinking about for the last few years, particularly in some of the research work I do. And it's really hard, as you say, to build governance structures when the current way that we're defined and categorised, in national data in particular, doesn't actually reflect our reality. You know, and I think the most important reality for me is, you know, my mob, the group I belong to. But when I look to data, I can't find other Nyampa Wongabon people, and I can't then compile a bunch of statistics together to say, well, what are the wishes, aspirations of other Nyampa people, you know, as a group, because we're quite dispersed. So one of the things I'm quite interested in is how do we, particularly for areas such as ours, so my family are close to yours, I think we speak the same language, how do we reconstruct, you know, those sovereign nations? So that's a piece of work that I'm currently involved with around a study that I lead, because we have to start from that basis. And I don't necessarily agree that we have to wait for anyone else to give us authority. I think now there's lots of us that have the technical skills, the capability and the expertise to take this on ourselves. You know, lots of us have gone to university for a lot of years, and you know, if we think about our cultural construct, it's about us taking that back and contributing to how we reconstruct that and applying a data sovereignty lens to that. So I'm happy to talk to you probably a bit later about that project, because it'd be, you might be very interested in it.
I just want to sort of just add, I just think we've seen in the constitutional movement the lack of governance structures attached to nation groups didn't allow us to actually
Contribute,
come together
yeah.
and give a mandate as a whole to do what we wanted to do.
Yeah.
We did become recognised in the Constitution because it was
Yeah.
all unclear who would represent it. And I think the same thing is around data here, is that the data movement, or sovereignty movement, we've got to clarify, or be able to ratify who's who through governance and through our own governance. And if we don't start to do this here in a proper manner, what happens is the overarching approach comes in, and we're going to inherit the same situation, and the next generation inherits all situations. And I can say that because I still live on country. I'm actually dealing in leadership in the most disadvantaged communities in New South Wales, and that's because of the governance structures that have been governing us, okay, and not including nation business and not listening to their elders. And that's because of this overarching approach. And we need to be mindful in our endeavours to move forward around data sovereignty, is how we do our governance, because it's very, very important for us to be clear and for us to build partnerships. And I look at I've been overseas as well with our brothers, our cousins and stuff that are over there doing this, endeavouring to do the same thing. But the governance structure seems to be a little bit more clear than ours.
Definitely.
I think it's just a conversation that we need to stimulate.
We don't have a treaty. They do everywhere else in various forms and iterations, and that really is to our big disadvantage. But if we follow our brothers and sisters overseas, the sovereignty rests entirely with the people whose data it is. And that's at the iwi level, at the nation level, at whatever level the data are, that's where the sovereignty rests.
I am hugely supportive of nation building. I am a Yorta Yorta woman and grew up in a Wabakal country, which is right next to Warramai. My family actually married into Warramai, so I have Warramai family. And one of the things I'm always conscious of is someone who didn't grow up on country, how do I get involved in supporting my mob? But also, I also know that I've been brought up in a household who knows who my mob is, very proud mob. And I have friends who are Aboriginal who know nothing about their mob. They may not even know who their mob is. So when we're talking about data sovereignty and we're talking about nation building, it's really important that it is in our nation groups, but how do we actually make sure that we're supporting the most disadvantaged among us, which are those that don't even know who their mob is? Where do they belong in this conversation? So I'm always mindful when we talk about data sovereignty and nation building that we don't exclude those and further disadvantage those that actually, to no fault of their own, because of government policies, due to racism, their families might have actually hid their Aboriginality. So I'm just, I'm really supportive of nation groups, but I also think we need to make sure we look after those mob too.
You're not that special, Janet. You have to use the microphone as well. Yes?
Hello, I'm Janet McCalman. I just want to offer a wider perspective, because this is not just an Aboriginal problem. The Productivity Commission was commissioned by the Turnbull government to look at the use of public data and making data, big data, available. The real danger for all of us is that it's going to become commercialised. And in fact, we need federal legislation which recognises the complexity of communities, the differences between states and jurisdictions, because our data belongs to all of us. And if we think about how medicine works, since the French Revolution, when you went into a public hospital as a poor person, you got free treatment on condition that your body, and later your mind, could be used for research and teaching. Since about the 1970s, when you go to the Royal Melbourne Hospital or the Royal Women's, they ask your permission, and that's been the change. But essentially there's always been a gift relationship, that medicine has only been possible because the poor have got in exchange for their bodies the best treatment. So they get the professors treating them, and they get that for free. Now our data is the same. It's held by government in custody, a lot of it, but a lot of it isn't, and particularly health data exists in hospitals, it exists in people's research computers, in data banks. We risk now, unless we have a comprehensive structure for the whole country and for all data, of that being used for commercial use. And those commercial people are hungry, whether it's going to be insurance companies or whether it's going to be pharmaceuticals or whether it's going to be all sorts of nasty businesses from ancestry onwards in terms of birth, deaths and marriages, who want to use us, and our data is as precious as our bodies. And it is just as important to science for all of us as our bodies. And it's the way in which what's happening in our bodies and minds is translated into forms that science can use. That's how modern medicine has developed over the last 200 years. And so let's think about this gift relationship that we all have, and I think possibly if it could be framed as part of a wider... You don't... No, all right, okay. But I'm not...
Sovereignty
No, I know
Symposium.
that... No, I fully appreciate this, the critical... it just doesn't rule out the fact that you have sovereignty within that wider framework that guarantees your ownership and control of your data. But I'm saying we're going to need a national approach to enable communities within that to have their control. Just a thought.
So if I was Tony Jones, I'd say I'll take that as a comment rather than a question. But the panel, I'm sure, want to respond. Thanks, Janet.
I had a look through that Productivity Commission report. I did my Control F test, which is search, put in the word Indigenous and see how many times it comes up. I then give it a score out of 10. It got 0.
Yeah, that's right.
So, you know, for us, well, I might disagree, Janet, that we have to make it into something bigger. I think maybe it does have to be something bigger, but that's not our job. Data sharing is especially risky for us.
Yes.
Because our data is very valuable. There's a lot of money to be made out of our data. And the fact that we're not even in the conversation about data sharing is, to me, it just horrifies me.
Yeah. And again, it may not be that it's only an Indigenous problem, but the way it impacts us is differently. Reinforces stereotypes, racism, the deficit dialogue, and that continues to maintain the power imbalance. I mean, I've seen a paper come out of Sydney University School of Economics looking at it was a comparison study looking at investing in hospitalisations or investing in healthy lifestyle choices. Again, not my choice of words, I wouldn't use choices, but that was what the paper was about. And in its discussion, it said a defining characteristic of Aboriginal peoples is our poor lifestyle choices. So this is the way our data is being used, and this is why it impacts us differently. So I appreciate it may be part of a bigger picture, but we do need to actually have our own strategy, because once you get consumed into the bigger picture, it really just becomes whitewashed and doubled down.
And I would add, in a library and archive context, that we're actually doing a lot at the national level, but we're not doing anything locally. So even thinking about places like Brewarrina, the cultural centre that's there, amazing, but what infrastructure is there, what support is there for young people to get training, to be the data curators, to be the people that are the, the digital keepers of our culture and heritage. So I think we've got the imbalance wrong, that we're focusing too much on the state and national and not hitting the ground where the support needs to be.
Can I just say too that Indigenous data sovereignty is not a scholarship, it's not a field of scholarship, it's a social movement. And as academics, I see my role just to do the grunt work and get some of the things out there. It's not to lead it, that's for community.
Yep, come down the front, please.
I'm Andrew Spall. I'm one of those quiet Kiwis from across the ditch. I'm an Indigenous data sovereignty advocate. Following on from Maggie's question, what levers do you, in terms of not being able to change the great big picture, what is possible for us as researchers, or especially Australian researchers, to use the levers that you have in terms of university research and ethical approval processes for changing the game and setting precedents in data sovereignty?
Well, I can give an example in my own research where, obviously I've been involved in the data sovereignty conversation for a little while now. So one of the projects that I lead, we've included an Indigenous data sovereignty component within the research. So out of this research, we're hoping to produce, a large data set that will sit at the university. We've managed to negotiate the university policies even. So Summer alluded to that often in the past it's been a situation where university academics have become the owners, or the university becomes the owner of that information. We've been able to use a specific provision in the ANU policy around cultural intellectual property, that can be shared with participants in research, because that's what we're doing. And so while we may be the custodian of that data, I don't own it as the principal investigator. It's shared within the participants, the ownership. Individuals still retain their right to that individual ownership of their data and can make many requests in relation to that. We also have provisions, so we will have tribal or nationhood data, so that specific nations that want to be involved, so I'm talking Aboriginal nations, Torres Strait Islander nations, not states or territories, as a group could potentially request data about that nation. So we've built that into our data governance of our research, recognising that this is what researchers in this space should be doing. So on that, we retain the data within the ANU. There's an all Aboriginal data governance group that requests are made to, and so the data is managed that way. So I think lots of research in universities can operate under this model. I also think it's a really good model that could be operated, say, at AIHW level. At the ABS level, Maggie and I have been advocating this, that we need to think about, well, how do we apply these principles? What does it look like practically for these large data holding institutions? And just implementing those principles. So we've taken the ownership, applied the principle of who owns it. It's shared in the common context, but you still own it as an individual. The control, we're about to have a meeting in a couple of weeks about what questions we want to prioritise around that data, and that's Aboriginal groups leading that. Access, so there's an access process to the data, and it's Aboriginal people that decide who may access that data. And possession. So possession is the final P from the OCAP principles that come out of Canada. And so that data is possessed at ANU, but there is a conversation about virtual versus actual possession, those sorts of things as well. So you can do this stuff, whether it's in research, whether it's in bureaucratic institutions, whether it's in local communities. So
how would the access work in a like a national collection? How would you apply that?
So you have to give up a bit of control, Fadwa. This is the thing.
Sorry, say that again.
You have to give up a bit of control, right?
I don't have control. I seriously don't have control. The people who have control are the providers of data, as I mentioned to you.
Well, they do as well. So if you took the AIHW as an example, what you would have is a group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that would, work on priority questions that could be asked of that data. So that involves lots of conversations. And those authorities that, control access now would have to say, as has happened in Canada, this has happened already, particularly in Ontario. So the chiefs of Ontario said that actually that's our data. We want to work on a bunch of questions for our communities. We're now putting those questions to the institute that holds the data. It's quite similar to AIHW. And there's agreements between that organisation, which is government funded, and the chiefs over there. And so the agreement is that if the chiefs come from their communities, wanting to know things about their communities in terms of their health data, that institution will help them answer those questions.
But where is that structure and mechanism? We currently don't have that.
We don't have this in Australia, so this is what I'm advocating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also think there's another really big opportunity here. The National Health and Medical Research Council are currently nearly finishing, without much consultation, revising their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ethical guidelines. And I think that data sovereignty could and should be built in to ethical guidelines.
We agree with you. I'm on that working group. There's actually a few of us who are actually in the room on the working group for the values and ethics. And that has been an extensive conversation we've had around the room around data sovereignty, IP. Again, it does come back to how it's defined legally within the current legislation. There's a whole range of things that have been considered. So yeah, we've been working on that. Is it 2 years, Jane? 2 years? Yeah. And that has been a very, very big conversation. And part of that conversation has been around, and I was going to bring up the values and ethics because I am on that group, is around ownership of data generally.
Because I didn't see it in the draft, and I did put in a submission on response from the draft and pointing to...
Submission.
Yes, thank you.
So how do you bring the community voice and nation's voice into this, knowing that there's such an extensive diversity out there? How would that mechanism work? Sorry, I'm asking a question because I'm trying to think of practical output out of this discussion, really.
So I think Jason's alluded to some existing structures that are in community, and we have to acknowledge that some of those reflect community and perhaps some don't. But we do have some governance organisations within communities. So the ones that come immediate to mind for me are things like land councils or prescribed body corporates. There's other structures as well that have been set up in communities around particular other issues as well that might be useful to a process. So it's finding out what kind of community-based governance structures sit there. I know that lands councils in particular have, they're an imposed structure, but they're an existing structure and you might be able to modify other ways of doing things as well. I'm also aware that there's some communities that have things like, I'm trying to think of the Inala one, where they've set up juries in communities as well, so something similar to a jury. And they, there's other structures like that could be utilised to get the kind of questions coming from communities as well.
And can I just make a comment? You mentioned ethics. So I used to work at the AIHW in the Ethics Secretariat and obviously on the values and ethics. And one of the things that the AIHMRC is very, very big on is Aboriginal governance. Yeah. Some researchers do that really well, some not so well, and it really is a battle with researchers. So I've also worked with them in their research support capacity. And actually bringing non-Aboriginal researchers up to speed, particularly those that have been in the field for quite some time, to understand why they might actually need Aboriginal engagement on an Aboriginal project can be quite challenging. The amount of times I've had researchers say to me, "But don't you know who I am?" And I'm like, "Yes, I've read your work, and that's exactly why we're having this conversation." Ethics plays a really important role, and Aboriginal ethics plays a very important role. It can be seen as gatekeeping, it can be seen as challenging for people, but ultimately it is about Aboriginal peoples protecting other Aboriginal people and our data and also our communities. So.
I might, thanks Sandra for your question. I might mention a project that I was involved with in looking across the room to Dr. Len Smith at ANU, working on AIATSIS, which is still operating at UTS Library, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Data Archive. I left state government working with basically records of the Protection Board, the colonial administration, to join that project because to me it was not about just digitisation, but it was about data transformation. And it was such a fantastic experience to work with AIATSIS in building the protocols. But one of the things that I wanted to comment in that time is that what we saw more than anything was legacy collections held by senior researchers that perhaps had deposited materials to places like AIATSIS and other state and national institutions, but they'd left other material in their collections that they weren't sure of what to do with. So they'd missed the ethical processes. Pre-ethics committees and were challenged with the legacy items, and I think that became really problematic because you even heard in interviews with participants that people were saying, what are you going to do with these recordings? And there was a big conversation in those recordings about destruction of content, which never happened. So I'm a big advocate of disposal of material as well, that I think often a lot of material goes into systems and it goes into larger kind of infrastructure, but there are things that are held to the side that are problematic, and I think Indigenous data challenges the system structure as it is, and we found that with AIATSIS, that everything that we were saying, we need an infrastructure that is about dialogue, it's about ongoing changes of things being open and closed and moving out of all of those forms. So we need to address those legacy items, but look to changes in our wider approach.
I just had the thought of like a gun amnesty, an Indigenous data amnesty, where people could sort of turn in their data without sort of repercussions.
Can I just make a comment? Like currently we do have Indigenous specific ethics committee across Australia. So whenever anybody submit a proposal to the AIHW to link data or do anything to do with Indigenous data, actually we have to go through all the ethics committee across Australia, and sometimes it takes about 3 to 4 years to get all the approvals coming from all the ethics committee to actually, for the researcher to, or us even to do the linkage work.
Yep.
So they do exist.
Yeah, there's a few. There's not one.
There's 2 in the Northern Territory. There is New South Wales has one. Queensland has one. Not so sure. Tasmania has one. I'm not so sure. Tasmania has Indigenous representation within their ethics committee. Because we get comments on our applications and things. So there are good processes, but they're lengthy and they really take a long time. So we need to be conscious as well while we're talking in this space around not making the process too lengthy and too cumbersome, so people don't actually try to do the work.
I had to go through them for my PhD, and it took 6 months.
Yeah, so actually it took us years because it depends how many data sets you're linking and so on. So
it's not always 3 years is what I'm trying to say.
I remember, Raymond, when you did your first project with us with ACT Health, how long did actually you finish before you could finish the project, I thought, at the time?
I don't know, 6 months, something like that. But it does vary depending on what you're doing. So, yeah.
And if we had principles around Indigenous data governance that were nationwide, it would really speed up the process because people would know
what to do.
Okay, another question.
Hi, Lisa Streeline from Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. There's a number of things I'd love to comment on. I would like to sort of underline the importance, but also the role of ethics and protocols and professional practices. It was interesting that right from the start we got tied up on the question of legality, and I think it can be a bit of a red herring. I think we know there are ways around some of the legal legacies we have. I think it's really important to identify legal barriers and work to take them down, but there's so much that we can do without worrying about the legality. So we've talked this morning about the difference between, well, we talked about ownership and we talked about governance, and I think the legality of ownership versus the reality of control are 2 really different things. And if we can create a reality of control, we have to worry less about the legality of ownership. And I think that's a really important principle that underpins a lot of this. And we have done a lot of work in Australia around overcoming the legal limitations of the recognition of Indigenous people's rights to their intellectual property through agreement making, including research agreements. And that's, a lot of this can be resolved by really good agreement making, investing the decision making and respecting the decision making authority of traditional owner groups. But also a lot of it's about policy. As Fadwa said, some of this limitation will come around state governments not wanting to release data. There's a lot of work we can do around policy advocacy that doesn't need legislative reform and doesn't need to wait for legislative reform. And for those, there were a few people here that were at the workshop over the last couple of days, but the growing momentum, if you haven't read Dr. Martin Parkinson's Wentworth lecture given a couple of weeks ago with a very strong, he's the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, and his emphasis on the role that data can play and the role that it can play in empowering local decision making. There is an opportunity here through the COAG process to actually make this happen. So it is important not to get too caught up in the idea that this is a war with big data, because there are pathways through it, and this is an opportunity to actually just identify those barriers and work out how and what's needed to get through them. So I would encourage everyone to not see it as a long-term impossible fight over the next 2 days, but actually something that has currency and reality that we can actually achieve some change, and including, reforms in ethics processes, alignment and, mutual recognition and all of those things that could actually make those processes a lot easier. That's certainly something that's possible as well to talk about. But I am aware that whenever I've had discussions in the public policy arena about this, the first two questions that come up are, but we don't own it, somebody else is controlling it, tell me about the legality, tell me about the ethics processes this is going to create, instead of actually looking at the opportunity that this creates. So I guess that's probably more of a comment, but I would appreciate any perspectives on, that idea of, identifying and overcoming barriers rather than just identifying barriers.
Thanks, Lisa, for that comment, but it does raise actually, it segues nicely into what I wanted you to start to think about and give us some examples. So I want to change the conversation a bit for the next 20 minutes before morning tea. Can you give us some examples from your quite different areas of expertise of how you have either used data positively yourself and or with good outcomes, or you've seen it used in different ways in terms of thinking about the challenge around, let's not just identify the obstacles, but what are some of the opportunities we might see, and identify some of those opportunities through examples.
So I think, I've given that example where I've been working with that Canadian mob around so recently I've been there in the last 2 weeks with them again, because I'm really keen to understand how they've actually enacted Indigenous data sovereignty in Ontario. And, as I said before, the chiefs of Ontario, so they have a governance structure from the community level, quite powerful, because that's under their treaty system. So if we had an equivalent in Australia, we could do a similar thing. Come together with the policy agencies to say, okay, we're going to have, so there were no legislative changes required in this whole process. That was the other thing. I'm sure they had lots of discussions about legality, but they came together and they signed an MOU. So the MOU specifies that the chiefs of Ontario could develop sets of questions of relevance to the different First Nations groups across Ontario, and that they would then put that up to a data committee. That data committee would they prioritise the questions that they want answered, so this is all health-related data, and that they would then use their technical expertise within the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, they call it over there, to answer those questions for those communities. And so it did take 3 years to develop that process for them, so it does take a little while. But I think in the next week or so, they're about to produce their first community-level report on that range of priorities that the Chiefs of Ontario identified. So, that's a really nice example, and I'd encourage people to look at that model. And the Chiefs of Ontario are willing to share, their story in this context. So I think that's a really nice solution. Or an example that we could look to.
So a governance model and an MOU which has changed priorities, is that correct?
Well, it goes a bit to what Lisa was saying. So what happened in that whole process, this is my assessment of what happened in the process was, so the conversation went very much the same. It's like, we don't own the data, we want to own it, right? To more about the control. So there are problems around owning the data, strictly, retrospective legislation, all this. So that's where the legal conversation come in. But they thought, well, how can we get around this? And so that was agreement about control. So this whole process that they developed is about controlling who asks the questions, what the questions are, how the data are being reported. So that group, the data group, assesses all of those things. So the data's still available. It's available to other people to ask questions of as well. Researchers can ask questions, but the process, so there's a process that they go through and they have to describe, Maggie talks about her standpoint, so the standpoint in her book. People have to talk about that, how they're going, and that informs how people look at the data. Are they going to produce deficit discourse, like some mentioned. So all of these things are taken into account when people apply to analyse these data. And then, of course, like the AHMRC has in its ethics process as well, before reports are released back out into the public, though that governing group checks that report to make sure it's not replicating deficit discourse, racism, stereotyping, those sorts of things. So there are solutions, and I think that's a good solution.
Thanks. Other examples, Maggie?
Look, the closest thing we've got in Australia, and it's not perfect, but it's a lot better than most other things, is the longitudinal study of Indigenous children. And that's because that has an Indigenous-led governance group. I've been involved since 2004, so I have to declare my bias here. But the first meeting I went to, the Department of Social Services gave us the questions, the overarching research question that was going to guide the study. And we looked at it and said, I don't think so, because it was all about what government wanted to know. And so, to their credit, they said, okay, what would it look like if you were framing the question? And we said, well, it should be about how do Indigenous children grow up strong? That's the question. And if items don't fit within that overarching question, then we don't include them. They also said you've got 18 months to get it on the ground, and we said, no, I don't think so. It's going to take whatever time it takes for all the communities, because there are 11 communities, to be convinced that participating in this study is in their interests. And it took about 3 years. But 10 years down, that study is still going. It is 89 to 90% retention rates. And people are saying, well, and I think people have stopped saying how this has happened. They've just accepted. But it's always at risk. It's always at risk. Every 2 or 3 years, there's another public servant comes in and asks why we can't combine the ILSIC study with the longitudinal study of Australian children, because that would save money, and we're asking the same questions anyway. And we have to go back through. Luckily, we've got a steering committee that have stayed the long term, and Fiona over there, who has stayed the long term within the department, to make sure that it doesn't get disbanded, and because our families will drop out. You know, like as soon as the purpose stops being working out and helping our children to grow up strong, our families won't participate anymore.
So I want to push you both a little bit more. You both talk really a lot about process, but sticking with the LSIC data, how has that data been used in a positive way?
Well, every year the communities that participate get a community feedback that talks about what's happening for their community, for their children. Each family gets a personal feedback about what's happening for their child. The data are not being used as much as they should in the research community, but there is a brand new book out called How Do Indigenous Children Grow Up Strong, edited by Maggie Walter, Wayne Bodkin-Andrews and Karen Martin, all Aboriginal first authored research chapters by Palgrave Macmillan, out now. So we're pushing for data to be used from ILSIC, but to be used positively. And one of the things we've come up against, to access the ILSIC data, you have to go through a little tiny thing where you're asked in about 50 words to put what your approach is, what your standpoint is. Non-Indigenous researchers are refusing to fill that out. And when they are filling it out, they've actually got a plagiarised one that keeps going around and isn't happening. So they're plagiarising standpoint, which I just find amazing. And I know that the people at Department of Social Services get really stressed when they have to keep going back out to researchers and saying, we can't give you this data until you actually complete this 50 words about your approach. So it's, yeah, and the risk is, all we're trying to do with that little bit to ask is to get people to be a bit reflexive about what they want to use these data for and how that actually will support Indigenous children growing up strong. So anybody out there, researchers who want to do some good work with the data, please write to DSS and apply for the set.
Maggie flew down, or up, well, from Sydney, but with excess baggage, so she's got some books here to sell.
Don't need to, selling like hotcakes.
Thanks. I'll just give the example around data for the empowered communities. So we were asked, we work with PMLC, and we were asked that the empowered communities wanted access to or certain analysis of hospital data and mortality data to inform the policy and programs. So we provided all that data to the 8 empowered communities, and we have to go back to the states because the data comes from the states just to get approval to release it publicly. And that's a good use of data because people at the local level are able to use that data to improve outcomes for their communities. The other example I will give is the work that we do with the National Key Performance Indicators, where we actually return a report back to each service on its data, and we work with them to improve the quality and understanding of the data. And we also, the board gets a PowerPoint presentation of what the data means and how they can use it. An example of bad use of data is probably around when you say there has been an improvement in some Indigenous outcome, but then you see the word but. And that really puts a negative, like negate the positive by having the word but, makes it a bit of a negative, and you still see some of that being reported. We progressively, in the Institute, have changed the way we present data to focus on an Indigenous story, but the government agenda is around looking at equity. Still, the Close the Gap campaign started with Indigenous leadership. It wasn't actually a government who imposed that. Indigenous leadership wanted the Close the Gap campaign because they wanted equity between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And therefore, we do say the gap is that much, but we actually tell the Indigenous story first, because if you put the gap at the beginning, all the focus is around the gap. So there is a way to present the data, but still also show the equity agenda, really, because we're trying to close the gap in between the two populations until we have a new agenda around the new targets and what's going to happen with that. And there is consultation currently happening around in that space.
Thanks, Fadwa.
So my PhD is on the NKPIs, and I can't help myself. The AIHW does send out a report on the data. They have to wait till all the national data is collected. There are exceptions reports. Sometimes that takes a while. And the services, it does take a while for the services to get that report. When they do get that report, they are great. Now, there are some, however, issues within services around the NKPI data reports. There are big services that have skilled staff which can interpret and use that data. Then we have some really small services which have limited capacity and often actually don't use those reports because they don't know how to read them. And if there are services available at the AIHW or Improvement Foundation to help those services interpret that data, services often don't know about it. So again, when it comes to access data, it's not just about accessing the data in terms of the physical, context. It's actually accessing it in terms of understanding of what it means and how to use it. And I think for some areas they're more advanced, and in other areas are less advanced. And we're not actually all starting on a level playing field. So
it takes time, yeah. The services are really good at the service. We've been doing it for nearly 7 or 8 years. Yeah.
I might just mention the Aboriginal Trust Fund Repayment Scheme in New South Wales is both a great opportunity and a failed opportunity in terms of looking at historic data. New South Wales government realised, in their wisdom that they'd held monies of Aboriginal people held in trust funds. So cases of children who had been apprenticed out, in my case with my family, child endowment monies. So there was a large investment in looking at historic records to re-index, to, I guess, contextualise those in a greater way, and to look at how to open access to government archives. I think during that period and working on the scheme, there were so many more possibilities that could have come to hand, and I think New South Wales government are now looking at another round of reparations. But one of the things that we saw so much in that period is that the records didn't actually correlate in any way whatsoever, of course, with lived experiences. So we had advocated for a right of reply to add new data to those historic records during the trust fund, and unfortunately during the scheme the only thing that was actually enabled was a statutory declaration saying that the lived experiences were very different. But I think going back to that historic context, we've got a lot of opportunity to enable a response to those collections that don't actually give a picture of Aboriginal lived experiences.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes, so questions? Yep.
I love your socks.
They weren't meant to be visible. John Boffer from Congress in Alice Springs. I just wanted to share the perspective from, in Melbourne earlier this year we had the World Public Health Congress, and there were lots of sessions there on a global attack on control of data and academic freedom from a political economy perspective. And I think we need to understand the demise of the AIATSIS, the demise of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Equality Council in the context of a global process that's going on against participatory democracy and ownership of data. And that was basically pretty simple. It was saying if you live in a post-truth world, in a world where someone like Trump can get up and say, you know, there were a lot more people at his inauguration than there actually were, then governments who are trying to protect the massive concentration of wealth that we now have and don't want that story to get out, they have to attack structures that are about getting the truth out. So structures that own data, participatory structures where people from the outside get to have an insight into what governments are doing, are being dismantled globally. And I think that although I agree with what Simon Finlay said, you can't just, that's not the only perspective. You've got to try and achieve what you can within the current system. But we are in this context where, you know, if you look at the number of advisory committees that the government, they've at least 50% less than they were a few years ago. And the Aboriginal advisory structures that we fought so hard to get with the transfer of health funding, things like the National Council on Aboriginal Health, which became the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Equality Council advising the Health Minister, that went first. But to hear Ngazi had just suddenly went, I mean, we got told at a meeting of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Health Service Data Advisory Committee, which still exists, but they just announced that Ngazi was gone. And this is happening across government, the participatory structures that enable us to get, although I agree with the point Maggie made, they're only advisory, they're not controlled, but they're better than nothing, and they're going. So the Global Public Health Conference did talk about the political economy perspective of all this, and there is this bigger struggle, and then within that there's the Uluru Statement, which is getting to the point, if you don't get that sort of sovereignty, is it really possible to have data sovereignty without, you talk about Canada, they've got treaties, they've got greater sovereignty, so maybe a few comments on, we need to have a both-and approach to this, otherwise we probably won't achieve what we want to achieve.
I think you're right. I also think there's another element as well. So I was on the Gats head, so I was one of the people that this weird letter just showed up randomly out of the blue to say, sorry, your services are no longer required.
Did you know that was coming?
No, I didn't know. I had no clue. So you go through all the usual emotions straight away. Angry, so I rang Fadwa straight away. I'm like, what is this? I didn't do that forcefully. But I also think now there's quite a few of us around, we might be working in the academic sector, but, I use this term loosely, we're sort of academic advocates in a way. And we kind of, part of my kind of remit now is I'll participate in advisory structures where I can contribute, but I'm also really interested in driving the agenda myself. So I'm interested in setting up, a national network. I will participate in that if it's led by Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander data warriors. We get called. It is part of that movement, and I think we also have to take that on board ourselves and just push through and kind of understand all that stuff that's going on, because it is going on. But if you kind of have to see the light at the end of the tunnel as well, and so understand while that goes on. That ebbs and flows quite a lot with the policy and politic world, but keep pushing through, because then we end up with great conversations like this as well, if there's people just keep pushing.
Just a comment on the committees, actually. It wasn't just Ngazi Head, NISC, NIPSI, all the national committees that deal with data has been, they're all gone,
And I'll just say, I do believe in using the structures that are available to us, because they are the structures at this point in time. For example, I almost always now refuse to be on an advisory committee and expect to be a CI on a project, because then I do have a little bit more power. But at the same time, I do think we need to change the structures to make sure that they are in keeping with Aboriginal worldviews and Aboriginal ways of doing business. So I think it's about attacking it from two ends, and
Okay, one last question. Anybody? Final comments from the panel?
I agree that we need a lot of activism. You know, working within the structures is essential, but I don't think we're going to get anywhere with that. I think that we need to do the grassroots activism to actually make the changes, and as has been mentioned, not wait for others to do it, but kind of step in and get it started.
Yep, if we're going to have Indigenous data sovereignty, we need to take the leadership role.
Yeah. Someone told me the other day in relation to something Aboriginal, we need to go softly, softly, and I said no.
No.
No. Hell no, we're not going softly, softly, because that's what we've been doing for however, you know, since invasion. So it's about time we actually rock the boat a bit.
Yeah. I'll just have to say we are supportive of providing data to communities. We need to work what's the best governance structure, but this is the direction that the Institute wants to go into, like the Empowered Community Program, as well as capacity building, and I think we'll talk about that towards the end of the program.
Sounds like an open invitation, Fadwa. Let's flood them with requests.
So I think by both definition but also by example, the world's going to be a somewhat different place by tomorrow afternoon once the symposium is finished. Can you join me in thanking the panel?
Can I just quickly say it's International Day of the Girl, and it's actually fantastic that there's so many women standing up here on this panel. So it may have been completely by accident, but, you know, well done.